What would you do if the only way to save yourself was to break the most sacred laws of human morality? The history of polar exploration has many examples of heroism, but the expedition led by Adolphus Greely stands out in this list of icy tragedies. This is not just a story about battling the cold. It is a chronicle of the slow disintegration of a civilized society trapped on a patch of land in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. 25 people set off for the end of the world with scientific instruments, perfectly ironed uniforms, and the confidence that discipline was stronger than the elements. They planned to study the climate, record magnetic anomalies, and expand the boundaries of the known world for the glory of science and progress. However, instead of triumphant discoveries, they were met with icy captivity that lasted hundreds of endless days and nights, turning the proud officers into shadows of their former selves. Food supplies, calculated to last for months, disappeared at an alarming rate, and the promised rescue ships never appeared on the horizon. At some point, the hunger became so unbearable that the line between the living and the dead began to blur, forcing the survivors to make decisions that would make your blood run cold. Watch the video to the end to find out the true price of survival in a place where humanity dies before the heart stops. What if I told you that this disaster was programmed from the moment the expedition was considered the most prepared in history? Lady Franklin Bay, where Greely's group was headed, seemed like the perfect place to establish a permanent scientific base as part of the first International Polar Year. The U.S. government allocated enormous funds to prove its superiority in polar research and science to the whole world. The team consisted of the best specialists, each of whom had undergone rigorous selection and was prepared for the harsh conditions of the Arctic. They brought with them the latest equipment, hundreds of books, musical instruments, and even chess to brighten up the long winter evenings. It seemed that civilization had finally found a way to conquer the wilderness with intelligence, planning, and technical equipment. None of them could have imagined that this very confidence in their own abilities would be the first step towards their demise. The atmosphere on board the ship that took them to their landing site was filled with optimism and anticipation of great discoveries. Soldiers and officers discussed future meteorological observations that would revolutionize our understanding of the planet's climate. They built Fort Conger, a sturdy, spacious building that was to be their home and fortress for the next 2 years. This structure seemed like an indestructible island of safety amid the endless ice and piercing winds. Inside, strict military discipline was maintained, regular checks were carried out, and a clear daily routine was followed. Greely, a man of strong principles, believed that order and subordination were the main tools for survival in any conditions. The first year of the expedition was incredibly successful, providing science with a huge amount of invaluable data on weather and tides. The group even managed to set a new record for advancing north, surpassing the achievements of British explorers of previous centuries. This achievement caused a storm of excitement in the camp and strengthened people's belief in the success of their mission. The ship they had been waiting for was unable to reach Fort Conger and was forced to turn back. Greely and his men took this calmly, as they still had supplies for another year. They were confident that the following summer would bring warmth and the long-awaited change. The second winter passed in the same rhythm, but a subtle tension began to hang in the air. People continued to conduct scientific observations, but conversations increasingly turned to home, food, and the arrival of the ship. Psychological fatigue was building up, and the confined space and polar night were weighing on the minds of every member of the crew. Greely tried to keep up morale by organizing lectures and entertainment, but people's eyes betrayed their anxiety. They began to realize that their fate depended entirely on the whims of the weather and the condition of the ice. The isolation from the world, which at first seemed romantic, was now turning into imprisonment for an indefinite period. Leaving Fort Conger, they left behind some of their confidence and peace of mind. Entering a zone of complete uncertainty, the men looked back at the home that had sheltered them for 2 years with a sense of deep longing and anxiety. Ahead of them lay uncertainty, a struggle against the currents and winds, and the hope of encountering civilization. It was a moment when science gave way to a bare struggle for existence. The story of Greely's expedition ceased to be a report of success and turned into a chronicle of survival. It would be very interesting to hear your opinion on whether they should have stayed in the safety of the fort or whether the risk was justified. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about how one navigational error can cost dozens of lives? The journey south began with a difficult struggle against ice floes and unpredictable currents in the strait. The small steamboats they used struggled to make their way through the thick ice slush. Every kilometer of the journey was a struggle, requiring tremendous physical effort and constant attention from the crew. People accustomed to a sedentary life at the base quickly lost strength, getting wet and freezing in the wind. The hope that ships or at least warehouses with provisions were waiting for them at Cape Sabine was the only fuel that drove them forward. The situation worsened dramatically when their boats became trapped by massive ice floes and drifted in an unknown direction. They had to abandon their boats and drag heavy sledges with provisions and lifeboats across the drifting ice. It was hellish work. The ice constantly broke and cracked, threatening to swallow the men and their meager supplies. They slept right on the ice floes, waking up to the rumbling of colliding blocks and the sound of water. The constant dampness and cold penetrated to the bone, and no clothing could protect them from this piercing horror. It was almost impossible to navigate this chaos, and every step could be their last. When Greely's group finally reached Cape Sabine, they were met with a cruel and crushing disappointment. Instead of a ship with smoke billowing from its funnel or mountains of canned food, they found only a note in a tiny cache. The note reported the loss of the Proteus and that no help was to be expected in the near future. This news hit the morale of the men harder than any Arctic storm. They realized that they were alone on a lifeless piece of rock, without food, without fuel, and without any chance of rescue in the near future. With the onset of polar night, darkness enveloped the camp, plunging the people into a state of deep depression. Without sun, normal food, or warmth, their world shrank to the size of a stone hut. Conversations died down, replaced by long hours of heavy silence and delirious dreams of food. Each day was similar to the previous one, differing only in the degree of cold and pain in their empty stomachs. They began to realize that this winter would be the last for many of them. Command errors and a combination of circumstances had brought them to a point of no return, from which there was no escape. The irony of fate was that a few hundred kilometers away, at Fort Conger, there were mountains of food and fuel. But this wealth was as unattainable as if it were on the moon. Gryl's group became hostages to their own discipline and belief in orders. Have you ever thought that sometimes it is strict adherence to the rules that leads to the most tragic consequences? Want to know a secret that will change your perception of human endurance? Hunger is not just an empty stomach. It is an active, aggressive process of destroying the body from within. When normal food supplies ran out, the polar explorers' bodies began to devour themselves, breaking down muscle and fat. First, the subcutaneous layer that protected them from the cold disappeared, and the frost began to cause physical pain with every touch of the air. People turned into living skeletons, covered with parchment-like gray skin through which their bones showed. Their movements slowed down, their voices became quiet and creaky, and their eyes sank deep into their sockets. In an attempt to trick their stomachs, they began to eat things that a normal person would never call food. They boiled sealskin belts, trying to extract every last drop of fat or protein from them. Shoes, bags, book covers, anything of organic origin went into the pot. This soup tasted disgusting and was practically indigestible, but it filled their stomachs. They chewed on old buffalo hide sleeping bags that had been soaked in mud and sweat over the years of the expedition. It was a desperate attempt to prolong their lives for at least a few hours, for one more day. The first death in the camp came as a shock, even though everyone understood its inevitability. When Sergeant Cross died in January 1884, it broke the psychological dam. death ceased to be something abstract and entered their small refuge. He was buried in a shallow grave on a rocky slope, barely covered with stones, as there was no strength left to dig into the frozen ground. The others looked at the mound and wondered who would be next in line. Spring brought no relief, only intensifying the torment of hunger and despair. The hope that had appeared for hunting quickly faded, as the people did not have the strength to hold weapons. They saw birds and seals but could not catch them, which was the cruelest torture. Nature around them was awakening, while the people in the hut were slowly fading away. By June, less than half of those who had landed on this shore were still alive. Those who were still breathing resembled mummies, barely able to move their arms. They lay waiting for the end, no longer hoping for a miracle of salvation. Don't forget to like if you are impressed by the willpower of these people in the face of imminent death. Guess what happened next when hunger began to destroy not only bodies, but also the moral foundations of the team? In extreme survival conditions, discipline is the thin thread that holds the life of the entire team together. Adolphus Greely understood this better than anyone, and kept his people under tight control until the very end. However, hunger pushes people to do things that seem unthinkable in normal life. Small thefts began from the common supplies, which were stored as the greatest treasure. Some sneaked into the pantry at night, others tried to hide an extra biscuit during distribution. Every gram of food stolen meant that someone else would not live to see the morning. It was simple and cruel mathematics of survival at Cape Sabine. Greely warned, admonished, and threatened, trying to appeal to the honor and conscience of his soldiers. But the instinct for self-preservation drowned out the voice of reason in the officers' orders. The atmosphere of trust that had held the expedition together for 2 years began to crumble before their eyes. People began to look at each other with suspicion, guarding their meager rations. The main problem was Private Henry, who was known for his physical strength and arrogance. He was caught stealing food on several occasions and did not even try to justify himself. Henry was confident that in such chaos, no one would dare to take extreme measures of punishment. He became a threat to the survival of the entire group, undermining the commander's authority and sowing discord. His behavior said, "I will survive at any cost, even if you all die." The situation reached a critical point when Henry was caught stealing again, even after a stern warning. Greely realized that further leniency would lead to mutiny and the death of everyone left. He made the hardest decision of his life, one that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He gave a written order to shoot Private Henry for theft and insubordination. It was a court-martial in a situation where there were no judges or lawyers. The remaining days passed in anticipation of the inevitable, but there were no more thefts. People shared the last crumbs equally, knowing that any deception was punishable by death. This cruel lesson became the foundation of their last days of existence. They died honestly, observing the order and rules established by their commander. The story of Private Henry has been debated by historians and ethicists for over a century. Did Greely have the right to take a man's life to save others in peacetime? Or do the laws of war apply in the Arctic, where the commander is the law? This question remains open, and everyone finds their own answer. But the worst was yet to come, when death by bullet began to seem merciful. Are you ready to find out what final line the survivors crossed when the food ran out completely? In the spring of 1884, food supplies at the camp at Cape Sabine ran out completely and irrevocably. The last reserves, which people had kept for the darkest day, were used up, but they too ran out. Now they fed only on lichens, which they scraped off rocks and the leather from their equipment. The men resembled ghosts, their minds clouded and their bodies refusing to obey. They lay in their sleeping bags, waiting for the end, which now seemed like a release from their torment. Storms tore the roof off their dilapidated shelter, flooding the dying with icy water and snow. They didn't even have the strength to repair their shelter and simply lay in the wet slush. The cold penetrated the deepest corners of their beings, freezing even their thoughts. They no longer spoke, saving every movement of their lips and every breath. Only moans and delirium broke the silence that enveloped Cape Sabin. Hunting became impossible, as no one could walk 100 meters without collapsing from exhaustion. The rifles lay rusty and useless, as the shooters' hands trembled too much. Even if the game came right to the door of the hut, they might not have had the strength to kill and butcher it. Nature around them lived its own life, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding beneath the pile of rocks. The sun shone brighter and brighter, but it did not warm those whose blood had almost stopped circulating. Greely continued to keep a journal, even though the pen kept falling from his weakened fingers. His notes from those days are a chronicle of agony written by a man staring death in the face. He recorded the death of each comrade, noting the time and cause, although the cause was the same for all. He remained the commander even when there was almost no one left to command. His will to live was phenomenal, and it was this that kept the others alive. No one spoke of it aloud. It happened in a semi-delirium, in the twilight of consciousness. It was a secret they wanted to take with them to the grave, hoping that no one would find out. But the marks on their bodies would tell the rescuers the terrible truth that could not be hidden. Cape Sabin witnessed man's descent into the abyss of despair. By mid-June, only 7 of the 25 were still alive, and their days were numbered. They no longer waited for ships. They waited only for peace and an end to their suffering. Life flickered in them like a barely noticeable flame, ready to be extinguished by any breath of wind. These were the last days of the darkest expedition in the history of the Arctic. What if I showed you a time machine that would take us back to the moment when the most terrible secret of this expedition was revealed? When the rescuers finally set foot on the shore of Cape Sabin, they saw a scene that haunted them in their nightmares for the rest of their lives. They expected to see heroes or graves, but not what met their eyes. The ruined hut, surrounded by bones and remains, looked like the set of a horror movie. But the most terrifying discovery awaited them when they examined the bodies of the dead, which were buried shallowly or simply lying on the ice. Traces were found on the bodies of many of the dead that could not have been left by animals or decomposition. Soft tissue had been neatly cut away with a sharp object, exposing the bones. These were knife marks, marks made by human hands driven by unbearable hunger. The officers of the rescue ship were shocked and ordered the bodies to be packed up immediately to hide this fact from the sailors. They understood what a scandal and what horror this truth would cause in society. Cannibalism is the last taboo of Western civilization, a line that cannot be crossed. But there, at Cape Sabin, Victorian morality collided with the brutal reality of survival. People did not kill each other for food. They used the bodies of those who had already passed away to prolong the lives of those who remained. It was an act of extreme desperation, committed in a state of clouded consciousness. The cut meat was used as bait for catching shrimp, but there is evidence that it was also eaten. Interestingly, the survivors themselves never spoke about this among themselves after their rescue. It was their shared dark secret, binding them together in silence. They lived with this burden until the end of their days, carrying with them the memory of the taste of their friend's flesh. It is a psychological trauma that cannot be healed by any awards or honors. The story of cannibalism overshadowed many of the expedition's scientific achievements in the eyes of contemporaries. People forgot about the meteorological data and maps, discussing only the gruesome details of survival. This was unfair to the efforts and sacrifices that had been made. But scandal always sells better than scientific achievement. Documents confirming these terrible facts are still kept in the archives. They serve as a reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization is in humans. Take away food and warmth, and ancient instincts take over. What do you think? Can people be judged for actions committed in a state of madness caused by starvation? June 22, 1884, was a day of rebirth for the handful of people who survived at Cape Sabin. The rescue ships Tethys and Bear broke through the ice, guided by experienced captains. When they spotted a figure on the shore waving a flag, silence fell over the ships. The rescuers lowered their boats and rushed to the shore. not knowing who they would find there or in what condition. What they saw shocked the hardened sailors and caused some to turn away. The survivors looked worse than prisoners in the most terrible dungeons, dirty, unkempt, with crazy eyes. They could barely speak, making hoarse sounds like the cawing of crows. Greely sat in his tent, clutching his diary, and could not even get up to meet his rescuers. One of the rescuers later recalled that it was like meeting the dead risen from their graves. People cried, laughed, and tried to hug their rescuers with their bony arms. They were immediately given food, but in very small portions, so as not to kill their weakened stomachs. The taste of bread and milk seemed like divine nectar to them, something they had forgotten. The 6 survivors stood on the deck, leaning on each other, under the gaze of thousands of eyes. They were a symbol of the resilience of the human spirit, which had conquered death itself. But their eyes were forever frozen with the cold of the polar night and the horror of Cape Sabine. They had returned from hell, and part of their souls remained there forever. The 1884 rescue operation went down in history as an example of the courage and perseverance of sailors. The captains of the Tethys and the Bear became national heroes who saved the honor of their country. But the main heroes remained the 6 who survived against all odds. Their story of rescue became a legend. The moment when the rescuers and survivors met is one of the most emotional scenes in the history of polar exploration. "Who's there?" asked a voice from the tent. "The whole world is here to save you," replied the officer. This phrase became a symbol of hope that never dies. Returning home did not bring the survivors the peace they had dreamed of. The initial euphoria was replaced by a wave of rumors and accusations when details of cannibalism surfaced. The press, hungry for sensational stories, seized on the topic, turning heroes into villains. Newspapers published chilling articles, often exaggerating and distorting the facts for the sake of circulation. Greely and his men had to defend themselves not only against nature, but also against public opinion. Adolphus Greely, being a man of honor, categorically rejected all accusations against him. He defended his people, claiming that they had acted within the limits of what was possible in inhuman conditions. However, the results of the autopsies performed after their return were irrefutable. This created a dual attitude toward the expedition. On the one hand, admiration for their fortitude, and on the other, disgust at what they had been forced to do. Exhibitions with artifacts from the expedition drew crowds of people eager to touch history. The boat they sailed in, the flag they raised at the northernmost point, all of these became sacred relics. America learned to be proud of its heroes, even if their halo was stained with blood. The story of Greely's expedition became a lesson for future explorers. It showed the importance of logistics, communication, and psychological preparation. Many mistakes were taken into account in the preparation of subsequent expeditions to the pole. Their suffering was not in vain. They paved the way for others. In the end, time put everything in its place, turning scandal into heroic myth. Greely and his men took their place in the pantheon of great explorers. Their names remained on the map, and their story lived on in the memory of generations. Despite its horrific ending, the Lady Franklin Bay expedition achieved phenomenal scientific results. For 2 years, they conducted hourly meteorological observations without missing a single measurement. These data, recorded in neat handwriting in thick journals, are the gold standard of 19th century climatology. They are still used by scientists to study global warming and climate change in the Arctic. They collected a rich collection of flora and fauna specimens, many of which were described for the first time. Herbariums, stuffed birds, rock samples. All of this was preserved and delivered to museums. People were dying of hunger, but they kept the boxes with samples, understanding their value to science. This is the highest example of dedication to a cause when the result is placed above one's own life. The expedition refined the maps of the northern coast of Greenland and Ellesmere Island. They discovered new fjords, islands, and glaciers, filling in the blank spots on the world map. The record for the farthest north, set by 3 members of the group, stood for many years. It was proof that humans could penetrate the harshest corners of the planet. The paradox is that it was precisely their desire to preserve this data and equipment that slowed their retreat south. If they had abandoned all their scientific cargo, they might have been able to move faster and save themselves. But for them, science was their raison d'être, the goal for which they took this risk. They could not return empty-handed. The scientific achievements of Greely's group are often overshadowed by their tragic demise, but it was science that held them together for so long. They were warrior scientists, fighting for knowledge on the front lines of the unknown. The price of this knowledge was 19 lives and the crippled destinies of the survivors. Was it worth it? From a humanistic point of view, no, but from the point of view of progress, perhaps. Science often requires sacrifices, and Greely's expedition paid the highest price. Today, Cape Sabine is a quiet, deserted place where only the wind whistles among the rocks. Only ruins remain of the stone hut, barely discernible against the harsh landscape. But the aura of tragedy and courage still hangs over this piece of land. Memorial plaques and crosses remind the few tourists who visit that what happened here a century and a half ago. The story of Greely's expedition teaches us humility in the face of the forces of nature. It shows that no technology or plans can guarantee safety in the fight against the elements. The Arctic does not forgive mistakes and overconfidence. It demands respect and caution. This lesson is still relevant today as we continue to explore space and the ocean. The fate of the ordinary members of the expedition has not been forgotten either. Their names are carved on monuments, books are written about them, and films are made about them. They were ordinary people who found themselves caught up in the wheels of history and showed incredible resilience. Each of them contributed to the common cause of survival. Over time, the topic of cannibalism ceased to be taboo and became the subject of serious analysis by psychologists. It allows us to better understand the limits of the human psyche and the mechanisms of survival. We stopped condemning and began to sympathize, understanding the horror of the choice they faced. We must remember this story so as not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Planning, logistics, and humanism are the 3 pillars on which any expedition should be based. Greely's experience is written in blood in the survival manual. As we conclude this story, we leave the heroes of the expedition in the peace of the eternal ice. They did everything they could, and even more. May their souls find the peace they were denied in the last months of their lives. The story of Adolphus Greely's expedition is one of the darkest and at the same time most majestic narratives about polar exploration. It is a mirror that reflects the best and worst traits of human nature: nobility and selfishness, fortitude and despair, discipline and chaos. They went north in search of scientific discoveries, but instead discovered the abyss within themselves. The survivors carried this experience with them throughout their lives, becoming living witnesses to what a person is capable of for a breath of life. Which theme in this story do you think resonated with you the most? Scientific achievement, moral choice, or an incredible will to live? If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories about survival and historical mysteries, be sure to subscribe to the channel.